if people ever feel like lost and confused with these things, definitely pull it back to the principles, especially when they get lost into program
Mhm.
design. If they just pull it back to, okay, so specificity, overload, progressive overload, and what I need to achieve in my program, and then don't overthink it. Don't try and make the perfect, most optimal program possible because we can't possibly know what that is. Get something together that's productive, that you feel like is hard, and you're progressing it over time.
Wits and Weights community, welcome to another episode of the Wits and Weights podcast. Today, I am thrilled to welcome Steve Hall, founder of Revive Stronger, host of the podcast of the same name, and competitive natural bodybuilder. Now, I invited Steve on the show. I'm a big fan of his and a follower of his show, and I wanted him to share his insights on what it really means to train hard and how to effectively apply scientific research to your own training in that context. We'll get into the nuances of training principles like reps in reserve, RIR, proximity to failure, and minimum effective volume, MEV, and how these concepts relate to muscle growth. We'll discuss how to bridge the gap between research and practice based on your individual response to optimize your gains while minimizing injury risk. Now, Steve's journey in the fitness world began after a near-death experience at the age of 20, where he suffered a severe head injury. And during his recovery, he discovered bodybuilding. He revived Stronger, where the name comes from, which helped him regain control of his life and ignited his passion for self-improvement. With over a decade of experience in the gym and years of coaching under his belt, Steve has definitely made a name for himself in the world of natural bodybuilding. He placed second at the WNBF Worlds in 2021. Steve's approach to training and nutrition is grounded in the latest scientific research, which he combines with extensive practical knowledge to help his clients achieve outstanding results. And in my opinion, his show, the Revive Stronger podcast, is one of the best evidence-based podcasts out there. So go follow it when you're done listening to this show. Steve, my man, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much. As we were saying off air, it's always nice to be on the other end. It's always an honor to be brought on and have my thoughts brought to the floor a little bit more because I get to speak to some of the brightest minds in the industry. I'm very thankful of that. But there's a lot of thoughts going on. And as I'm sure as a podcast host, you know this, when you're listening to the other person talk, so many thoughts go through your head and you don't always get to say them. So it's quite nice to be here on the other end. And thank you for the very kind intro.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it is a challenge of trying to really listen and absorb the message while we're just having that conversation and bring out your expertise. And it's true. When I went back and looked at your feed, because I listen to every episode of yours, you're almost always interviewing these big names. And it's sometimes I'm like, man, I just want to hear from you, Steve, you know? And so I wanted to bring you on the show because people probably have the same thought. And so before we get into the topic itself, I'm not going to say, hey, what's your story per se? I don't want to go that generic. I want to link this to the idea of improvement of how bodybuilding itself and building muscle, while it could seem to be this vain thing that certain people are just obsessed with, right? And there's definitely certain behaviors that go behind that with like food and anorexia or orthorexia and all these other topics. You're very passionate about it. So am I. We have podcasts where we talk about this stuff all the time, and they seem to be linked to values, like, you know, having control of improving yourself. Tell us about the link between those.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think on the surface level, bodybuilding probably looks like so superficial and so just like egotistical and vain and just like weird, right? Especially competitive bodybuilding where you see the guys in just, I don't know, the tiny little thongs on stage and they're all
Mhm.
tanned up and greased up. You're like, what are these guys doing? They're flexing. And it was actually hilarious. This is a slight side note, but I saw a reel. It was Arnold Schwarzenegger and he was like posing in front of this woman. I think it's in a film or something that was like he was part of, but it was like a meme. It was like when you're a bodybuilder and all you've got about you is the gym and you go on a first date for the first time and she's just like, she
Yeah.
just starts laughing at him. He's like, this is a front double bicep. This is a front lat spread, like trying to impress her. She's just like, what the hell? Like laughing her head off. So I think from the outside, that's the way people view it. But to actually like the process behind it, it's kind of like that's the peak of the iceberg, but like underneath is like, well, that's the chunk of the iceberg. And that's where all these other values and things can be found. And for me, like bodybuilding has given me a route to better health for sure. It gives me direction every single day in my life. And it's also given me essentially a business and it gives me something to look forward to every day. So yeah, there's so much you could dive into with that question, but
Sure.
like a quote that I love, and I don't know exactly where it's from, but it's like progress is happiness. And it's a quote I love. And that's the way I feel about bodybuilding. Every day, I feel like I'm progressing towards something. Like I get out of bed and I always feel like I have a purpose. It doesn't matter what's going on in my life, what stresses are going on. If things have been bad with the business, or I don't know, had an argument with my girlfriend or whatever it might be, I know that day I've got a workout to do. I've got some nutritional goals to achieve. And if I do that, I know I've put in another little penny into my like muscle growth deposit. And it feels so great to be able to have that. And it also gives you kind of direction with various questions that come out at you. So if you just a lot of decision making can be hard if you have no direction in your life. But I'm like, this is make me a better bodybuilder. Like I can look at so many things that I make and have choices in my life. Like, shall I watch this extra episode of whatever show I'm watching, or shall I
Mhm.
go to bed? What's going to make me a better bodybuilder? Let's get to bed. Like these various things. So, yeah, for me, it gives me such a sense of purpose and direction that, yeah, I owe so much to like the bodybuilding as a whole. It's not even the competitive side is something else, but the whole philosophy behind, yeah, progressing yourself, bettering yourself, having that purpose, the routines and habits that have to take place, and how you can put those into other aspects of life, like growing a business or into relationships. And even with us, you mentioned like you've been in the evidence-based space for like 5 or so years now, like understanding that there's the science and principles behind this, and you can be skeptical about other things that you hear in life where you just don't accept someone's word at
Mhm.
face value. And if something sounds too good to be true or what have you, you can be like, I'm going to look into that myself. So it's given me some skill sets for day to day too. So yeah, like I said,
Yeah.
I owe a lot to bodybuilding.
Man, there's so much there that I resonate so hard with, and I'm sure a lot of people do. But the idea that the physical pursuits required by bodybuilding, even if you're not competitive, even if you're just trying to, be a lifestyle enthusiast in this, translate to everything else, right? And I often say the physical has to come before everything else because it enables those things. But your idea of incorporating passion and excitement and purpose and driving these all together, and then they translate to business and everything else, is a great message. I got a text from a friend this morning. He was quoting, I think, the 4 Hour Work Week, Tim Ferriss, and he said, excitement is the more practical synonym for happiness, and it is precisely what you should chase. It is the cure all. And I get that from you of like, the passion and the excitement, comes before the other things. And then, hey, you get to make a business out of this too, because you just love it so much. People want to hear and get your help. And it's a win-win for everybody. There's no cognitive dissonance. So it's a great message, Steve. So then, like, let's segue into the topic as smoothly as we can, which is training hard. And honestly, a lot of this is, how do we train hard? How do we progress in life and in bodybuilding? And so let's talk about the bodybuilding side and hypertrophy. Even when I go on shows, people say, "Hey, you talk about lifting heavy. What does that mean?" Or you talk about training hard. What does that mean? Like, just answer that, like, super easy question, Steve, right? Super easy question to answer. And then we'll dive into details.
Yeah, it's a good one because I think you have to specify training hard for the goal of muscle growth, because there's a lot of things I could do in the gym that would be freaking hard, but they
Yeah.
ain't growing me any muscle. Like squatting on a bozo ball, or like, I don't know, doing treadmill sprints. I've done those before and that was hell. Or doing a
CrossFit,
spin
anyone?
class. Yeah, there's a lot of
Yeah,
things you can
yeah.
go into the gym and just like, I think most people think training hard is just like exhausting yourself.
Right.
I know I used to own a t-shirt that said "Go hard or go home." So like, it's just that's the kind of characteristic of bodybuilding, especially in the UK with Dorian Yates and everything. It's like hard training. But I think hard, when I translate it to like a scientific term, could be looked as overload, maybe.
Mhm.
Like it has to be overloading for the body. So it has to be hard enough to cause a stress response for the body to have to respond to. So it has to be overloading. And how do we make something overloading in regards to specifically for muscle growth? I look at it has to be overloading, meet an overload threshold for proximity to failure. In fact, some people may be able to grow very, very far from failure. I think there's studies on like newbies cycling and they grow. Most of us who have been training for a few years are not growing from cycling. We won't maintain our muscle from cycling. We probably need to be quite close to to failure, as we're going to speak about a little bit more. So when I consider that for someone who's been training consistently for many years, like practically 3 or 4 reps from failure is about as far as you probably want to be. Going much further from that, you probably don't know where you are in terms of proximity. Like it's just too easy to really know that you're training hard enough. Reps need to have slowed down, involuntary to you trying your hardest. And then the body's actually trying. Like that's as simple as it gets. Like,
Yeah.
oh, a set actually got hard. It felt challenging when I was going through it. And then the other aspect of hard and a threshold for growth is you need to do enough of it. Doing just one set of squats a week it wouldn't grow my quads or glutes. It would probably maintain them. I don't know. It might not, to be honest. It's probably under my maintenance volume. Probably maintain quite a lot of people's. And like I said, it would someone new to the gym. I mean, that would grow them for sure. But after a while, it would no longer meet that hard slash overload threshold for growth. So we need to do enough of it to be able to grow. And that's that minimum effective volume you spoke of, like that MEV. You need to do enough of that. And when I think of how low is that, as I've already kind of demonstrated, the newer you are to the gym, the less well adapted you are, the less of a stress, the less hard is a lower threshold for you. But the longer you've been training, and practically for anyone who's been training for a few years, like it needs to be a significant amount every week that you're doing there. The actual lower amounts, they're probably depends on the muscle group. It will depend on the person. It will depend on the exercise selection. It will depend on how close you go to failure. There's so many things it depends on because there's a lot that goes into productive program design. I would view it as 4 to 6 direct sets for a muscle group is probably like going to start growing you. So if you're at 4 to 6 and you're anywhere from 3, 4 RAR closer to failure, I think you're doing a good job to probably be growing. But I would test that assumption, see if there's progression, and I guess that segues into a slightly different discussion. But that's how I view hard is I would translate it into overload, and then I would think of overloading specifically for muscle growth, meeting thresholds for relative intensity. So it needs to be close enough to failure. And I'll add one actually. It needs to be sufficient volume, which I look at as sets of proximity to failure. And then actually the other layer there would be it has to be heavy enough. The reason I didn't introduce it is because there's such a wide range of kind of rep ranges or loads that would grow you. I think all the way up to like 30% of your 1 rep max has been shown to grow you at least over the studied time period. And so like 5 to 30 repetitions is probably a great range to be in with being that proximal to failure. You could go heavier and still meet growth thresholds. It's just inefficient. That's why I tend to have 5 as my kind of cap there. And above 30, we just don't have good data to suggest that you're growing particularly well at that point. And practically, even going above 20 reps isn't particularly fun. I think now and then it's a great thing to do potentially, but it's not much fun.
Yeah, no, there's a lot of personal and practical aspects to these. And I want to get into that because you definitely laid out some boundaries. Like we can't, we say it depends a lot, but it's not like it depends on anything. It depends on certain principles and certain boundaries. So I like some of the metrics you gave us where you said, okay, there has to be a stress response so we can adapt and grow. What does that mean? Okay, we have to push hard enough. Okay, there's a certain number of reps from quote unquote failure, which again could be a squishy thing for someone who's new. We can talk about that. And then enough of it with volume because you can't just go, once a month or once a week and do, 2 sets and then heavy enough. And that's the other argument. I'm glad you gave a very wide rep range, because there's definitely some dogmatic thinking, especially old school, like strength versus hypertrophy rep range. And then you've got the effective reps model on the other side, which is like any rep range just has to be the hard reps at the end. Let's drill into one of those. I want to talk about the psychological aspect of pushing that boundary when you're kind of a newer or even intermediate lifter who maybe hasn't worked with a coach and so they haven't really been pushed. What does it mean to feel like you are close to failure or even to have that heuristic of like, this is my failure point? What's a good way to get there?
Yeah, it's a really good question because effectively, I wouldn't like it's hard to, if you've never trained to failure, know what the reps before that are necessarily feeling like. A good example I always use is put someone who hasn't really trained before on a leg extension and they'll do like 10 reps. It'll start burning and they'll be like, man, I can't do anymore. And then you'll be like, no, you're good. Nothing slowed down. You're still producing really good concentric force. And then they maybe do another 10. And that's actually been examined within research when you get people to just like pick a load for how many reps they can do, but then you push them and you give encouragement. Hey, they get like a double the number of reps that they necessarily thought they were. But if you look at people and even newbies who haven't used RAR before, if you get them to rate it like as they go, so you don't just get them to pick a load and then do 10 and they're like, oh yeah, I thought that was my max, but you encouraged me to more. If you get them on there, you give them the load and then they're like, oh, how many do you have left? They realize they're better at rating. Oh, actually, I have more in me than I thought, and they can keep going. And they're actually much better at engaging it. The latest meta-analysis, I think, essentially looked at saying that most people are around a rep away from where they thought, and
Mm.
kind of they undershoot by a rep. So they probably had one more in them than they thought. So people are pretty good at gauging it. And when you go and you train, it's actually a quite nuanced discussion, because I think some people think it's like, hey, so 3 or 4 reps in reserve, you get a slow rep. The other ones before that, they all look about the same. So maybe it's a 2 second concentric and it's dropped to 1 second. And then it's like, okay, it then drops to like, again, 25% less than that, less than that, less than that. And then you hit failure. But for some lifts, and you'll probably know this too, Philip, like you can sometimes just hit a wall. Like as soon as I hit a slow rep, that's one RAR. I got one
Mhm.
more good rep in me, and then I'm done. I think that comes down to just different leverages on various exercises and things like this. So if we're talking about like a full range of motion lat pull down, the lats themselves are strongest in the lengthened position at the top, but the exercise itself is hardest in the short position where you're weakest. So suddenly, like you can't grind out reps maybe the same way. You could grind out some more partial reps up at the top. So it's a little bit different there versus pressing, where if you're doing a dumbbell press, yeah, I mean, that's going to be a little bit more matched in terms of what's strongest and where it's hardest in terms of that lengthened position. You're strongest. It's also hardest in that bottom position. And then some machines are just like a bit wacky. I know I have this pendulum squat I'm using,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
even different pendulum squats can differ. I've got a Watson, like old school pendulum squat I'm using. And I know as soon as I hit like a slow rep on there, I'm like, I am quickly toast. I watch a video of it and I'm like, oh, it looks like I had more in the tank, but I just know from having gone to failure that I don't. And I think that's the really cure all is maybe you start your training where you're like, yeah, I'm getting some slow reps. It's feeling hard. It's feeling challenging. I have to really concentrate to get those repetitions, and they've slowed down. I've kind of finished that set and I'm like, yeah, my muscle felt challenged. But then you look to progress it over time.
Mhm.
Progressive overload is a super important aspect of muscle growth. You look to add a rep or add a small amount of load. And over the weeks, maintaining good technique, you're eventually going to hit a point where you're like, I tried for a rep, but I couldn't get it.
Yep.
And then you know where that is. You know how the reps before it felt. And you also have logbook data. So say you hit a bench press 100 for 10 reps. The 11th rep, you failed. You had a spotter, like you're still alive, you're fine. You know, if you start a new mesocycle and you want to be 3 reps in reserve, 100 for 7, you're pretty confident. All things being equal, you had a good night's sleep, you ate well, you're not dieting, you can do that. And that will be a good gauge of where your 3 RAR is. Hopefully, over time, 3 RAR now becomes like 102.5 for 7, and you like get stronger over time. That's obviously the goal as a kind of marker for muscle growth. Your strength increases, but essentially I think that's probably the best way to go about it. I think some people just say, hey, like newbies aren't good at training in proximity to failure, so just train them all to failure all the time, because they're not good at it. And I'm just like, it's a risky approach, first of all, because their technique often isn't great,
Right.
especially as they approach failure. It becomes very risky. Also, as we spoke about before, the people who can grow the easiest are the newer people, and they can leave more in the tank. So you don't have to push them to that
Right.
point. So I would say not even to take a barbell back squat or even a bench press. Maybe if you're spotted, you can take it to failure, but do it on safer lifts generally. Like do it on maybe a Smith machine squat is relatively safe, or a
Mhm.
hack squat would even be even better. Leg extension, fine. Like take it to the house. Nothing bad is going to happen if you do that. But yeah, for like your barbell free weight lifts, you probably don't want to do that so often. But I think you can learn enough from these other lifts that you kind of get that experience. So hopefully that kind of
Yeah.
answered the question.
It definitely answered the question with as much, very comprehensively as I expected. So there's little pieces in here I want to pick out for what I know the listeners thinking. First, kind of going backward, I know when I first started training heavy or hard, actually using progressive overload and tracking, sets across was also a very helpful tool just because I didn't know my failure point, right? Where sets across, progress each session, it starts to get into that failure regime. And then you like, oh, now I know what failure is. So that's interesting. But a few things you mentioned. One is the slowing down. There's a lot of, we want to get objective with some of these, right? So when I think of slowing down, and I'm sure you've had this experience where you feel something slowing down, you watch it back and it didn't slow down at all on video, right? And there's like this dilation effect almost. And in other cases, it's obvious. Like you said, with the lat pull down, you just start to pull and it literally just won't go. It's slowed down. So, what are your thoughts on that? Does it matter that much if you're just progressing, or like should people use video? We're not going to have velocity sensors or anything like that. But what do you think?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought velocity up, because I know that's something that's being looked into, are velocity trackers. But I actually just spoke to Jake from Data Driven Strength,
Mhm.
who they're part of Mike Zordos's lab. And they've been looking at velocity trackers and trying to use them in practice as maybe a way of like, hey, it's a small investment for someone who maybe like ourselves, who uses RER and we want to be more objective about it. It's not a crazy investment to do. I think it's practically might be hard in the gym. I've never used one, but he was just like, actually, it doesn't seem to be panning out how we thought it might. It doesn't seem to be that objective. So it is hard. And I think it therefore relies more on that personal experience with failure on various lifts and various muscles where it might be slightly different. I'm sure you've had it, Philip, where I know I've had clients where they hit a grinder and I'm like, okay, you're done. And then they get like three more and I'm like, okay, so they knew they had more in the tank. So actually I can't look at a video and tell them their RAR. And this is something I think so many people get messed up is because they think there's just this one, like, hey, you hit three, it's that slow, two, one, zero. It should look like this for every person under every circumstance. It just doesn't look that way. And so I always say to clients, I never can tell objectively what your RAR is. I just say if I think you had more or less. And then sometimes they come back to me like, Steve, you know what, you're right. Or they might come back like, Steve, there's no way. And I'm like, well, okay, we'll test that maybe and see how it goes. But yeah, then on the same kind of line of thought, you have the grinders, but then you have that person who just whatever about them, if they're fast twitch dominant, and so they just fatigue very quickly, they just suddenly hit a wall, and you're like, oh, I did not expect that to happen.
Yeah.
And I actually really had this. It was very cool. I got to train Das Gym in Vienna, which if you haven't heard of it or you haven't seen it, Google it. Anyone listening, it's one of the coolest gyms in the world. Yeah, and we managed to go there as a team. So myself, Pascal, and Mike Chalice, they're all coaches on the team, and we train together. And it's just funny because we're all so different and how we respond to things. Like I think I'm fairly average in terms of my grindability and what RER looks like. Mike, on the other hand, he can just keep going. You're like, he's been like grinding for like 5 reps here. What's going on? And then I would say Pascal's slightly towards the other end where he fails a little bit quicker than I do. And it's like we're all very similar age, very similar number of years of training. Muscular development isn't that different between us yet. Our RAR can look quite different. So I think it really has to come down to personal experience with this. And the better you use it, just like any tool, the sharper it comes, like the better you are at using it. And I think you mentioned something really important here is like, how important is it if you're progressing over time? Like, I'll put up a squat video and I'll say, hey, I thought this was like zero RAR. And someone might, I get a bunch of comments, be like, no, you had more in the tank, Steve. Like, come on, push harder.
Mhm.
I'm like, I actually don't mind if I did or didn't. I knew I was very close and I knew that was a PR based off previous performance. And so if I keep PRing and I keep seeing new numbers, new strength numbers, I'm fairly confident whatever I'm doing is meeting those thresholds, that it's hard enough and it's progressive enough. And I know I don't have to train even to zero or one or like I don't have to train that hard. I can probably
Right.
make up for it through the volume. Now I don't want to, and I'm very confident in my RER assessments, but at the end of the day, it actually doesn't matter because maybe I met hard and sufficiently overloading through a different variable. I pulled on that volume lever a bit more. Whatever is happening, if I'm progressively overloading, I know something good is happening.
Yeah, and the converse of that is fatigue, right? Where if you were going to zero IRR constantly, it could have a negative long-term impact on your ability to come back in the gym and hit that again, which is important, especially as we get older and recovery and joint issues start to become an issue or whatnot. Maybe we can get into that. One other thing comes to mind, I think you alluded to it, was kind of in the lower rep regime, maybe testing 1RMs or I don't know, using ascending sets or something like that to find your RPE. Like, do you have a favored one or two methods for, again, maybe beginners, intermediate folks, where you would program it a certain way where they inevitably find that spot and objectively?
Yeah, so normally get there through an accumulation. So I normally am like, hey, let's start out hard, week one, where you think you're anywhere from 1 to 3 RER. Try and be a bit closer to 3 RER on those big compound heavy lifts. Try and be closer to one on like an isolation based lift where it's just the fatigue cost, like you said, is just much lower. Whereas going to 0, 1 RER on like a leg press week one or a hack squat, it's quite fatiguing. It might not be worth the trade off. And so you can get a better stimulus to fatigue trade off, staying a bit further from failure. Then next week, I want you to match or beat it and keep going, matching or beating, maintaining good technique like you had in week one until you can't. And then you have that objective number. And if you found that like your week one numbers to your however long you were able to go for. Say you were able to go for 8 weeks and you managed to add a lot of reps and load. Yeah, you went too easy week one, but maybe you didn't, and maybe it worked out like, oh, I managed to add, I don't know, 10% to my lift and match reps the whole way through. It was 5, 6 weeks. Sounds like you were pretty spot on. So you quickly learn via that kind of just accumulation of going there. Other options would be, and I think you kind of alluded to this, maybe taking the last set to failure. It kind of then indicates where everything else was.
Right.
And it's a quicker feedback tool than necessarily going weeks and weeks and weeks without going there. I, with my clients, will get form videos week one. So I'm very making sure, like, are they training hard enough in that week? Because if they're leaving loads of reps in the tank, there's a real issue that can happen there, is that they are not going to be generating that much stimulus. They might not meet that threshold, and they will feel very recovered because they're not training that hard. And suddenly they want to add loads of volume. But if you add loads of quantity of work, the quality inherently goes down. And that can be a real issue,
Yeah,
especially when you're already training maybe too far from failure. Now it's hard to train harder because you've got so much other things to be doing. So I'm very careful about making sure, hey, we've definitely trained hard enough that first week, because otherwise you can get into this kind of volume trap, I would call it, which I've definitely been in, by the way,
for
which
sure.
is why I kind of feel it. And I've worked with a lot of clients who have been there too, where they're doing way more volume than they necessarily need to because the quality wasn't there in week one.
Yeah, and I imagine you're asking them to self-report on RIR or RP or something, and kind of comparing like, maybe not, right? Like you said, you're a 9, maybe it's a 7, maybe it's a 6. And the accumulation approach is really smart, because even when we get more experienced, you're going to cycle through and you're going to introduce new movements at a certain point, and you kind of get that minor reset of, okay, where should I be, on these movements. I last did it, 3 months ago. So it's kind of a good approach. It's also in line with the idea that we shouldn't be going to the gym and just randomly doing whatever every day. We need to progress on something so that we get past, the neuromuscular aspect as well as the self heuristic kind of learning aspect, all their important principles.
Hi, my name is Alan, and I just want to give a shout out to Philip Pape of Wits and Weights for being a huge part of the foundation for my continued health and well-being. Philip exemplifies a nutrition coach who demonstrates how much he cares. Philip works tirelessly and with dedication to provide coaching support and major content for us to use. He creates a practical approach from research, and Philip empowers all of us to use food as quality for our health. He is skilled in how to assess and direct nutrition. Philip creates a community full of wisdom, support, and camaraderie. In summary, Philip Pape is the real deal. He knows how to assess and direct nutrition, and he continues to steer me in the right direction. Thank you, Philip.
So let's get into a little bit of some of the underlying principles. Besides, you mentioned proximity failure, you mentioned progressive overload, and you mentioned minimum effective volume. Let's talk about the training variables. So we've got volume, intensity, frequency. You mentioned, 5 to 30 reps could work. Now we're talking muscle growth, hypertrophy, maybe not so much max force production and powerlifting type training, but there are some camps like intensity versus frequency camps. What are your thoughts on all of that? Because especially, let's start with intensity. Let's start with load. Like, is there a time when someone should focus on the lower rep range, and why?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't say that there's any data suggesting that you need to focus on like a given rep range and somehow that's going to lead to better growth in future. I think it's a I wouldn't be against rep range being somewhat preference driven, because of the fact that we don't have any, like, no real reason to say if you push that set close enough to failure, you're going to grow just as well as at a different rep range. Again, we don't have long-term data of using those higher rep ranges, but I think bodybuilders like have been doing this for so long, where they've been using such a wide swath of rep ranges, where it's kind of like that anecdotal evidence, which is super weak. Like, it's not great evidence, to draw upon, but it's kind of helped by the fact it's been done for so long. And it's actually, like you mentioned with the camps, you have like your Mike Mensa, you have your Dorian Yates, but then you'll have like your Arnold Schwarzenegger, your Jay Cutler, these guys who, your Phil Heath, like they had very different methods of how they trained. But I bet, well, not I bet, all of them did. They trained hard
Yes.
and they met their overload thresholds, whether or not they pulled more on one lever versus another. It does seem to be that way a little bit, where there are things that you can do to generate a stimulus within the gym. Inherently, when you generate a stimulus in the gym, fatigue comes along with it. It has to. But So I don't know if there is always proportional fatigue. So for
Mm.
example, like a hack squat, one set of that produces you 10 stimulus, 10 fatigue, but leg extension maybe produces you, I don't know, 5. So you have to do more volume on that leg extension to get the same from the hack squat, but it's like you can both get to the same destination. Like
Mhm.
neither your SFR overall was the same. And I don't know if that's the same for, say, hey, you train closer to failure, you do less volume to kind of get to the same destination as someone else who trains further from failure and does more volume to get to the same destination. I can see an argument for that, especially if you keep them within these kind of, like you said, those parameters that it's like, hey, pick your poison, any road to Rome, you're going to eventually get there. Now, my kind of scientific, analytical mindset likes to think, and coaching mindset likes to think there's an optimal route somewhat, and it might be individual dependent to some extent. And I do think it can morph and change over time because I think fatigue dynamics do too. Like out of a deload, when you're essentially the freshest you can be, your stimulus to fatigue ratio and how to get the best of that might be different to
Mhm.
4 weeks into the program when you've adapted and you've accumulated fatigue. I can't say for sure, but these are kind of some theories that I have in mind. So, yeah, I generally, I don't know if this answers your question, but for my clients, what I like to do programming wise is assuming they're coming in fresh that first week, we're at least meeting those minimum thresholds for growth, as I suggested. So, I generally start people on those kind of isolation based lifts, higher rep ranges, lower fatigue cost lifts, 2 to 1 RER, not take them nice and close to failure. Your bigger compound lifts, maybe they're a 3 to 2, like a leg press, more to 3, like a lat pull down, a bent over row, maybe you go closer to 2. And you could also individualize that on like what's the volume tolerance of that muscle. If they're a very volume tolerant muscle
Mhm.
and you don't want to have to do so much volume to get that stimulus, pull more on intensity. So that's something I do for like abs, calves. I'm just like, hey, train those very close to failure because not many people want to do a ton of sets of those and they're very volume tolerant. Whereas your quads, most people's quads can't handle that much volume. So, and they get fatigued very easily. So we pull back on the intensity lever and put more onto the volume because it's not that much anyway. So regardless, I meet that kind of minimum threshold week 1, and then I'm just monitoring their performance, their feedback, and trying to get to a point where I call it like maximal adaptive stimulus. Mike Israetel obviously used the terms minimum effective volume, maximal adaptive
Mhm.
volume, maximal recoverable volume. I like to rephrase it into stimulus because I think that encompasses more of training because there's a lot of things that contribute to stimulus like intensity, volume, exercise selection, rest times, maybe frequency. There's a lot of things that go into it. So I like to get someone to this point where I'm like, hey, you're running an amount of volume, an amount of intensity that's really challenging you. You feel like you end every session where you're not completely destroyed, but you're like, damn, that was a really good workout. And you kind of try and match and beat performance in that position, progressively overload for as long as you can until fatigue catches up to you. So for a lot of my intermediate to advanced trainees, that's anywhere from 5 weeks up to like 10 weeks, depending on the person, their lifestyle. If they sleep really well, they eat super well, they're in a surplus, maybe less advanced, maybe they're closer to 10 weeks. Whereas for that more advanced person in a diet, they're sleeping poorly, they
Mhm.
have lots of stress, their fatigue's catching up to them sooner, then back off and go again. So I'm just careful not to, yeah, push too hard in any one direction and try and kind of
Mhm.
find this theoretical sweet spot between volume and intensity. Because when we look at the literature, it's like, it's quite funny because we had the meta regression from Zach Robinson that came out, where for the listeners, like a meta regression looked at lots of the studies and then like compared where on average is the best outcomes. And he was looking at RAR and muscle growth. And it seemed like there was this exponential relationship between training closer to failure, the more muscle growth you got. So 3, 2, 1, 0, and to failure, there's exponential muscle growth. So people are like, oh, answered our question. Like, surely best outcomes train to failure all the time. But the studies that were looked at were frequencies of mostly 2 times a week and volumes very low, not typical to what we would do. And then we have the other volume research where the recommendations from the meta analyses that they've been doing, which is very similar to meta regression. I can't speak to the nuanced
Mhm.
differences between the two. I just know those terms. But again, whole host of studies. And they find, oh, between like 10 to 20, or I think it's like 12 to 22, the latest systematic review found. It's like, well, that's quite high volume versus what was found within the meta regression. It's like, how do we piece those together? And we're still trying to like unfold things and work through that puzzle. And I think Martin Refalo, who I know you're aware of, who I've interviewed a few times on the podcast. He's doing his PhD literally in this subject of like
Yeah.
proximity to failure and muscle growth outcomes. And he basically had like the best study that's ever been done on this subject, where I think a lot of people thought the studies that had come out that looked at proximities to failure were like they were in the gym and doing RAR just like we would, but most of them weren't. They were just either not failure, or they were using velocity, and we're trying to estimate based off that. Whereas his was the first study to actually have subjects who were very good at calling RARs in a gym, 2 RAR, 1 RAR versus failure. And so he had subjects go through the same protocol, one leg doing one, the other leg doing the other protocol. What was the difference? And like there was basically no difference in the end. There were some nuanced differences which were cool, but yeah, it's still that's I think study is just a great framework for other people coming up through the field to look at and be like, oh, maybe we can replicate that, but through a different means and have a different protocol to try and kind of work this out a little bit. But I to not get too stuck in the weeds. And I think a lot of people are like, oh, science, man, it's so confusing. Like one time it's saying this, the other thing's saying this, like screw science. And I'm just like, I like to boil it down to maximize muscle growth. You basically want to train as hard as you can for as long as you can, as often as you can. There's a lot of ways to get to that kind of situation. And I can't tell you what the optimal route is, but so long as you know you're working your muscles hard in the gym often, you're making sure to most of the time recover. When you aren't recovering, you back off and then you go in again and you're progressing over time. You're probably doing a damn good job. And I think that's why there's so many jack bodybuilders in the world who weren't aware of these scientific terms and things like this and their different approaches because, I don't know, it fit their personality or they're their N=1 study and they just found, man, this worked for me. Why would I do something different? The struggle is you can't copy a Mike Mentzer and expect to respond the same way. You can't say, oh, look, Dorian did this, so everyone should be doing this, because that's the beauty of science. You actually get a swath of people, you get them on isolated conditions, and then you actually get to report like averages and get a better idea of what the general population should be doing. And science will never give us the perfect prescription. I think a lot of people hope it will, but it gives you those guidelines, which we've spoken about a few times. So I don't know if I answered that question again.
Always. No. You always. This is why I brought you on, man. I love the way you answered. And if anybody who doesn't like it listens to the show, they can unfollow. And we self-select our audience. But man, I'm a perfectionist, right? Like in certain ways. In that I used to, especially when I got into this world, I'd want to know the exact answer, and then I would do that, right? And of course, you would glom onto certain experts or people who are in that camp, and then you'd, to the exclusion of everything else. And like you've suggested, there's such a wide window. And if we just try to pick out certain studies and then the latest and greatest that gets pushed on, Instagram or whatever, we're just going to be bouncing around, I think. And it's maybe a better approach to just pick the things that, like you said, are preference driven and to some extent. I mean, I've gone through cycles of programming with my coach where I might be doing like an 8-5-2 rep cycle. And I'm like, I don't like the 8. Let's do the 5-3-1. And it's like, you get the same result. It's just a little bit different rep scheme that I enjoy more. Right. And that's part of consistency. And then, like you said, everybody has different levels of fatigue that can build up. So it's not in a vacuum, like the study that showed you should always train to failure, right? You're not just doing it once, you're doing it over and over and over again. And man, I'll tell you, there's certain parts of my body and others know, like their low back or whatever, where the fatigue just, you get to the point where you almost dread doing a certain movement because of it. That's maybe your body telling you something, right? Either you need to eat more, sleep more, change it up, whatever. One thing I did want to ask you about is when you program for clients and you get past the first week or two, do you program their loads or do you continue to program RIR?
So the way I prescribe it is that week 1, that's the only week I really get them to focus on reps and reserve. After that, like it's in a good place. You don't need to worry about it anymore. Match and beat. Now, some of my more advanced clients, I do want them to have a little bit of semblance of understanding of it, because if they're already at like 0 on say something very fatiguing and it's like, oh, week 2, then I'm like, hey, more so match performance, because you're going to run out of runway of progression over time otherwise. But generally, I don't like people to worry about it too much. Have an idea that you're in a zone that you want to be. And obviously, if you're hitting failure week 2, like you probably shot your load a little bit too soon, or you've had a bad night's sleep, or I don't know, you've had an argument with someone and your fatigue has just shot through the roof. And then we can regulate that as we move forward. But yeah, past that point, I actually don't like too much focus on the reps and reserve. Just knowing that they're within that range is good enough for me. I don't need to know that they've hit a bullseye. I just need to know they're on the dartboard. That's kind of the way I think about that.
Yeah, I like that approach too, because I think a perpetual focus on just RPE like maybe gives too much subjectivity there versus, hey, you've got a baseline. Why don't we build off that baseline and know for a fact that you're exceeding it going forward? You also mentioned max recoverable stimulus as opposed to fatigue. I like that concept too. I recently spoke to, it might have been Jordan Lips or somebody who was talking about like the vast majority of people, fatigue isn't so much the issue as they're not training hard enough. And I think it comes back to this discussion. Like if you get to the point where fatigue is an issue, maybe that's telling you maybe you've been training hard enough and now we got to learn how to manage it. But there are a lot of, I see it all the time, especially beginners who are like, there's zero fatigue. That could be an indication you're not training hard enough. You know what I mean? It's kind of, they play off each other. So it's great that you're focusing on let's get the stimulus as high as we can and then start to balance things out. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say, I
Yeah.
think it's very true. I think when you look at your average person in the gym, I look at the average person in my gym and I'm like, man, people must look at me like I'm a bit of a weirdo because like I make noises and I'm like really
Grunting.
challenging myself and like I might look like a bit of a crazy man because most people in the gym just aren't pushing themselves to that point of discomfort. Actually, that's part of it too. It should feel like uncomfortable when you're getting into like in a positive way. It's kind of hard. It shouldn't be injury provoking, but the muscle should feel challenged and it should feel uncomfortable in that muscle to some extent. Then that's like an element of you're going hard enough. But yeah, a lot of people will just go through the motions. And that's where that inbuilt progressive overload, where I'm like, match or beat, match or beat, match or
Mm.
beat. Because if you aren't doing that, you can definitely spin your wheels. If you don't logbook and have data to pull upon, like you said, if you're changing movements all the time, you're relearning everything. I mean, you could be training hard enough and you could be progressing, but you certainly can't be certain of it. Especially as naturals, we grow so slowly. We can't like reliably be like, oh yeah, I look bigger in the mirror. You probably really can't use that as a metric unless maybe in the first few months of training. I know you actually asked the question. I don't know if you want me to revisit it. Rep ranges. So you said any a time to do like low reps versus high reps and differentiating between those.
Sure.
Do you want,
Yeah.
I have
Go for it. Go for it.
yeah. I just felt like because you asked that question, like the audience are probably
I have
thinking,
so
"You
many
didn't answer
notes
that,
here,
actually."
man, that I would ask
Yeah.
you. We could talk for 4 hours. So it's
Oh,
all
for
good.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just one thing practically with rep ranges, something I like to think about is just some lifts are more suitable to certain rep ranges. It's just part of matter of fact, like a hack squat plus 15 reps. It's not super practical. Any sort of squat pattern above 15 reps, it tends to become quite a cardiovascular challenge. Whereas leg extensions, they're very suitable for like 10 plus reps, 15
Mhm.
plus reps into that 20 plus rep range. Below 10 reps on a leg extension, it just starts to become a challenge to stay in the seat and you just feel it in your joints and like your knees and things. It just isn't very practical. So quite a lot of the time rep ranges can kind of sort themselves out via what's actually practical for this lift for that person. Like a lat pull down, again, doing less than 10 reps on a lat pull down, it's hard to stay in the seat and have stability
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
if
It
you're
can pull
any
you
kind
over.
of
Yeah.
strong, so even I've done it in like the 10 to 15, like 12 rep range and I'm like, this is hard for me to stay down. I'll do it single arm, maybe I can do it then. Whereas a pull up, perfect in that rep range because it's already challenging to go much higher than that
Mm.
anyway. And so yeah, kind of rep ranges to some extent I think can be within ranges, can be self-selected via what's practical for the person to be able to do.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And it's again individual, right? Like some people may thrive on, doing sets of 10 or 12 squats and others are like this is torture, I'm great with 5. So
Your powerlifters.
yeah, my adductors are starting to give or some weird muscle starts to pop. So okay, so speaking of reps or range, well, actually range of motion is what I was thinking of next cuz partial reps and lengthened partials have been all the rage lately as well. What are your thoughts on that, both in the context of like intensity techniques and kind of add-on work versus like your primary type of training?
Yeah, I think it's really that's probably been the most exciting area of research
Mm.
because nothing too much else has changed. This is the thing where it's like everyone's just like full ROM, right? Like that's the thing. Everyone should be training full ROM. And again, the bodybuilders haven't been doing that. They've been doing partials for quite a long time. And they certainly didn't have any control in all their lifts either. You look at some barbell bent over rows or your like Arnie's cable rows, like he would just swing that thing back to get it short. And so it's very interesting seeing that and then see the research come out to look at these things. And in the past, I think full ROM was the thing that was promoted in the past meta-analyses as well. It was the conclusion full ROM is the way to go because the partial research looked at short muscle lengths virtually all the time. I don't think there were really any long muscle length versus full versus short. But when they do start looking at the long muscle length training versus full ROM, it seems that the long muscle length training seems to do pretty well. And I think I'm not the expert on this. Milo Wolf would be the guy who knows this because this is where his PhD has been. He did the latest meta-analyses. And I think there's over 5 studies now that have come out that have compared like long muscle lengths to either full ROM or some other muscle length. And long muscle lengths, they're either neutral to positive. So I haven't seen an outcome where people have grown worse from focusing on that long stretch position. Do we know the mechanism yet? No, people will debate this. Is it stretch mediated hypertrophy? I don't know, added sarcomeres? We don't know what the mechanism is yet. For me, I don't particularly care unless it has practical implications, because I mean, I like the science, I like getting into the weeds, but I'm a coach, I'm a practitioner, and I'm a bodybuilder. I want to know what's growing my muscles, and I want to know how I can make my clients grow more muscle. So it does appear that spending a little bit more time focusing on that length and position is a good idea. So there's many layers to this. So you could take it as far as, hey, I'm going to the only modification I'm going to make to my training is I'm going to bias more long muscle length training. So I'm going to do maybe less leg extensions, and I'm going to do more squats and sissy squats and reverse Nordics. And I'm going to do less spider curls, and I'm going to do more like Bayesian curls where the cable's behind me and I'm getting a stretch in this lengthened position on my bicep. And that would be cool. That's definitely one way you could take the research. And I'm definitely going to do full ROM. I'm going to squat deep. I'm going to get a big stretch on my lats when I'm coming up for a pull down or a pull up. Then you mentioned other ways you could incorporate it, and there's a number of ways. So as we mentioned, lat pull downs before, because of the kind of opposite resistance to strength profile of that, you could fail with many reps where you could have got partials. So you could extend your set. Once I can't get to my chest, I'm going to go and just get as low as I can and low as I can and low as I can until maybe eye line. You could call it, hey, I'm going to keep doing my kind of full ROM is a range now for me on lat pull downs. It's from like clavicle to eyes. Once I can't get to my eyes, hey, I'm done. Because I think there has to be some sort of heuristic or standardization of where is your cutoff point for range of motion.
Yeah, sure.
Otherwise, you're going to be like, hey, I'm getting a centimeter lengthened. Maybe this is growing. And actually, at the moment, we don't know how. So a lot of the researchers looked at about a 50% range of motion. So they just cut off the last 50%. So you're not coming like it's coming to about eye line for like a lat pull down, saying you're not doing all the way down. The lats haven't actually specifically been looked at, and that's some limitations within the research. They've looked at the calves a lot, which has been pretty cool. I've done a lot of length and partials for my calves because of the research that's come out. It's pretty convincing that we tend to grow more in that stretch position. So I've like not been doing that last little like up of the calf raise. And so that's been quite fun. And I think they've grown and responded quite well to that, considering how stubborn calves can be. I've been quite impressed by the progress.
What's your favorite movement to do that?
Good question. So I don't like bent knee variants generally. I don't think they make the most sense. They tend to they're biasing the soleus because of
like the seated,
way that, so the soleus is not the chunk of the muscle. The gastroc's like the chunk that's visually aesthetic, and the soleus just sits behind. So I'm like, why would I want a thicker soleus? That might look a bit, I already have like thick ankles. Like, why do I want like just a thick muscle there? So the straight leg variants hit both pretty well, and they bias the gastroc a little bit more. The gastroc gets the most of the brunt of the work. So I like straight leg variants. And honestly, people should experiment, I think, to find what suits them. Some people recommend doing it in like a leg press, because then you don't get axial loading, which I think is a cool idea. Like, it's not loading the spine, so theoretically less fatiguing. But I have this one machine, actually two, but there's one in my gym that does load the spine. And it's just, I think it's normally like a V squat or something like that, but I don't use it for that purpose. I just do calf raises in it. And it just hits me like nothing else. I know, because I train at other gyms and I try and do I did like a Smith machine calf raise in a gym. And I was like, man, I'm just not getting that stimulus I can get from at home. However, like that machine's set up with the load and with the foot plate, it just hits them perfectly. So I do think experimenting a little bit with straight leg variants as your primary. If you want to do some bent knee stuff, hey, have at it. I'm not going to stop someone. But I think the straight leg variant is probably the route to best growth, especially for like aesthetic calves.
Yeah. And you just mentioned like, see how you feel and try different movements. I mean, I think for me, the pitch shark, which I don't have one, but you can kind of rig up a similar idea of like a belt squat,
Ah,
seemed to work for the calves. I was just doing squats one day and I said, let me just add some calves in here. Like, whoa, got to burn. So yeah, calves are a tricky one, especially when you have a home gym to try to rig things up just the right way to get it to work.
yeah, yeah. When
Yeah.
I was, that throws me back to when we had the lockdowns and all of that. And I was just doing stair calves or like off like a stair. I was just doing single leg
Right.
stair calves. I was using my dipping belt to like weight it
Yeah. Yeah.
down and
Yeah.
make
Way
it
down.
harder and everything. And man, yeah, the reps just got a little bit too like high on that, and I ended up feeling a lot in my Achilles tendon, which is unfortunate. That can happen with calf training
Sure.
quite a lot.
Sure. Yeah, cool, man. So, all right, that we talked about the length and partials. Yeah, I know that's getting a lot of play now. So, I like the idea of doing movements full ROM that just happen to have an extended lengthened position. It kind of took me back to the days of like the 777 with the bar with the dumbbell curls, which you were trying to get the different ranges going there. What about
21s,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, or 21s? Yeah, yeah, right,
Yeah, that's
21s,
it.
exactly right. As far as all the so we've mentioned individual response, we've mentioned heuristics and like applying research to training hard. We've also talked about not like over relying on too many of these studies. I guess I don't know if we missed anything in terms of somebody who wants to keep pushing it and train hard and get feedback from themselves later on. So you talked about the ascension and the fatigue and all that. Is there something people should be tracking specifically? Obviously their lifts, but any other biofeedback, anything, even nutrition wise, or kind of correlating data that would tell them that they're training hard or not training hard enough or need to change up the programming?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is divergent views on this in the evidence-based space because it's not something that's been researched very well in terms of
Mhm.
this biofeedback. But I think everyone can relate to the biofeedback that we'll discuss, and I think I see value in tracking some of these variants because part of me is like, hey, they're a tool, and we don't have anything better to go off.
Yeah.
Actually, in a funny way, I view them similar to a diet, and we're trying to lose weight. We track the scale, and someone is tracking their macros and what have you. They're trying to hit a certain calorie, protein, fat, carb goal. Some heuristics you might also track alongside is like, hey, how's your appetite? Like, how's your hunger? How's your like irritability? Like, how's hanger basically? Do we
Mhm.
just ignore all of that, or that can those be useful feedback tools? Because hunger, does it actually matter for fat loss? Well, not really. Like if you boil it down to calorie deficit, but someone might not adhere to the diet. They might binge. It might give you some feedback of, hey, they're hungrier today, so or this week they've said they're hungrier. Look at their food plan. Oh, maybe we can put some boiled potatoes in there.
Mhm. Satiety,
Secret
yeah, yeah.
weapon. They
Yeah.
stuff everyone, right? You're having too many Cocoa Pops. Have some more oats. Like these are
Yep.
the things that are going to satiate you more. Whereas if you ignored hunger feedback from a client, suddenly they're binging on the weekend because they're like, Coach, man, I can't stick to these calories. It's way too hard. Whereas if you had that feedback, you can now make an appropriate adjustment to one of their meals. And similar here to some of this biofeedback, I'll make it make sense. So, like the pump is something that everyone knows about and has heard about. You think about a balloon filling up and getting to burst. Some muscles really get a very good pump, or they respond better to the pump than others. For me, like my quads, some of my quad pumps are just horrendous. I'm like, wow, like this is the craziest thing ever. Calves, my calves would never get a pump until I started actually introducing more length and partial work, really pushing the relative intensity closer to failure. I was like, oh, now something's happening. And so the pump tends to correlate with some positive things, I think. Whether or not that even could be, hey, coach, I'm not getting a pump in my quads off leg extensions. And you look at them doing leg extensions, they're just flinging the weight around. They're not bringing it down deep. And you're like, okay, control the eccentric, bring it down as deep as you can, like do all of these things. And you'll get, and they feedback that, oh, but the pump's better. Or it could just be like a foot placement difference on a leg press. Hey, when I have my feet here, nothing too much here. Oh, and obviously part of the pump is blood flow. I think blood flow going to muscles is a very good idea. If you're getting a pump, that muscle is clearly working. So as a feedback tool, as a coach and practitioner, I find that feedback really helpful. And then some other indicators be like soreness is something you can pay attention to. Now, and regarding the pump, the reason I say like it's divergent views is because we just
Mhm.
don't have evidence either way. There's not really strong evidence suggesting you can use the pump as like, and that it even indicates cell swelling. And we don't know if that is a mechanism for growth. And the same for like whether or not it does. So there's some like interesting, it's an area that we need more research and
Sure.
study on basically. But obviously bring it back to anecdote again, how many bodybuilders pay attention to the pump? I think
Yeah.
virtually all of them.
All of them. Yeah. Yeah.
And as a coach, it's been useful for me and with my own training. And then soreness is another key thing that you can look at. Actually, before soreness, I'll come on to another element that I name stimulus. So it's something I get my clients to track within their spreadsheets, in fact. And I used to have pump and disruption. So pump is as I described, disruption is more so the muscle feeling tight, lots of local fatigue. It maybe is like quivering. If you've ever done like leg curls and many sets and then you come off, you're like, my hamstrings feel like they're going to cramp. Like it's kind of that disruptive feeling. Hamstrings don't really feel pumped and full. They kind of feel tight and heavy. Same with like the back muscles like this. So I kind of name that disruption. I now combine the two. So I kind of combine those as pump and disruption rather than having my clients have to fill out all these different things. It's like, how's the stimulus? Think of pump and disruption. Is it like nothing, low, minimal, high? And that gives me some useful feedback. And then the other thing I get them to think about is soreness, but I only get it if it's more after the session than they expected. So I don't particularly care if someone gets sore or not in terms of they're growing. I don't think soreness, I don't think you have to get sore to be growing.
Mhm.
We have data, we don't have data to suggest that it's necessary. And in fact, it could be harmful. The thing I like about soreness is it tells me how fast someone's recovering. And it also sometimes you might finish training a muscle in a session and think not much happened, but the next day suddenly you get sore. That sometimes can happen. So I like it to kind of come in as like an afterthought. Did you get sorer than you expected? If you did, okay, then your stimulus was more than you thought you were getting. So it can be useful there. And then how fast is that muscle recovering? Are you recovering way ahead of a session, or are you recovering just on time, or are you actually sore when you're looking to train that muscle again? And that allows me to know about how they're dealing with the level of volume they've got through the week, how they're dealing with their frequency that they've got right now. Do I need to make a modification there? It might be that, hey, my side delts are feeling recovered like way ahead of time and they're doing 2 times a week. I'm like, okay, maybe we can go 3 times a week and we can get more growth. Or maybe, again, they're sore and they're overlapping. We need to back off on volume here so that we're not creating such an amount of muscle damage and stimulus that that's excess fatigue essentially that's now leading to worse performance, worse outcomes. So there's some of, like I said, stimulus, pump and disruption, and then soreness is something I like. And then essentially using soreness is also like a readiness tool. Are you feeling sore or not leading into a training session? There's some of the biofeedback measures that I think can be really valuable, like little toolkits that similar to like hunger and appetite during a diet phase. Like they're not objective things that you use to program with, but they can give you little insights into small adjustments you could make to make things even better.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I love those. That was one of the best explanations of those that I've heard, because I know a lot of people disparage these sometimes because, like you said, you don't need to be sore and the pump isn't necessarily an indicator of this or that. But it is almost subjective. I know it's subjective, but just like biofeedback, hunger and whatnot, it may be subjective in the moment. The trend over time tells you something. It's your body and you're listening to it and in tune with it. And the idea that the soreness tells you your individual volume response, not only systemically, but per muscle group, I think is great for individuals, who are listening, who even want to do that themselves, is just start marking that in their training log and really toning in on the different muscle groups and where you can add more volume and take away volume. So super practical, man. All right. So we're at the top of the hour again here. So I'm going to go to that magic question because we talked about a lot today, but is there anything you wish I had asked? And what is your answer?
Yeah, great question. And I appreciate that you thought that answer was a good one. It's always nice to hear. So yeah, actually, you told me this question was coming and I'm still like, I should have saved something in my back pocket that I wish you'd
It's a
asked
hard
about.
one.
And I wonder if some people just like, no, you asked all good questions. And honestly, you did ask good questions. Yeah, I can't necessarily think of anything in particular that we haven't covered that I wanted to cover. I just think if people ever feel like lost and confused with these things, definitely pull it back to the principles, especially when they get lost into program design. If they just pull it back to, okay, so specificity, overload, progressive overload, and what I need to achieve in my program. And then don't overthink it. Don't try and make the perfect, most optimal program possible because we can't possibly know what that is. Get something together that's productive, that you feel like is hard and you're progressing it over time, then little tweaks. And that's all we're doing with our clients is like we're making our kind of best guess, which is a pretty good guess, right? Because we're educated coaches and kind of work with a lot of people and a good amount of experience. We make our best guess at first. And then I'm getting all this feedback objective and subjective, to make the best calls to lead to the best responses for them, and learn your body over time. And it is a constant learning process. I've been doing this for, like, I've been training personally for over 15 years, and I always feel like I'm learning something. Like I said, from my calves, they've probably grown the most they have over the last year versus like 10 years before that, because I just simply wasn't training them as effectively as I could have. You learn things all the time. So yeah, never stop learning.
Man, you took it right back to the whole foundation of this discussion of personal growth and always getting stronger. And I love that. Going back to principles, don't overthink it, especially us perfectionists out there. Don't overthink it. Train hard, match or beat, collect feedback, and tweak, and you'll be fine. So awesome. All right. Where can listeners learn more about you, Steve?
For sure. Yeah. Thank you again for having me, Philip. It's been a really fun chat. People can find me at Revive Stronger. So revivestronger.com is our website. You'll be able to find our coaching. The podcast will be linked there too. I'm also most active on Instagram. It's just the social media platform I enjoy the most, at Revive Stronger over there. And yeah, you can find, like, if you like podcasts, definitely check out the Revive Stronger podcast, where I get to interview really smart individuals. And we also have the Improvement Season podcast, which is a separate podcast that I do with Pascal, my business partner and coach on the team, where it's a much more chit chat podcast, still somewhat bodybuilding related. We talk about our journeys, but yeah, we go off piste quite a bit on that.
Yeah, no, for sure, man. And I love it. I can't have enough of these in my feed, but then you got to figure out when to listen to them all. So revivestronger.com and IG at Revive Stronger, and also the Improvement Season podcast. I'll throw that in. It's been a lot of fun. We covered a lot of topics, but I think it's all practical stuff people need to hear and want to hear. So thanks again for coming on, Steve.
Thank you for having me.